I'm joined today by Kean University head coach Adam Hutchinson. And coach, I'm curious to know, do you have any personal experience with either nonviolent police harassment or non-lethal police brutality?
Yes, both. So the first time that, well, first of all, when we're children, we all believe the narrative that the police are here to protect us. I believe, 11 when that narrative was punctured. My older brother bought us tickets. My favorite team was Dallas Cowboys. My older brother bought us tickets to see them play at Giant Stadium. And, he and I went to the game. And we were leaving, and we got pulled over by the police up there and pulled out of the car, questioned what were we doing there? Do we have any drugs? Do we have any weapons? And searched on the side of the road. And ultimately let go. So I was 11 and I was skinny when I was young. I was not a fearful, fear-inducing figure at the age of 11 years old. My brother topped out at 5'6", maybe. And at that time, he probably weighed 155 pounds, 160 pounds. So he was not, particularly threatening figure either. Between the two of us, we were never able to figure out a reason for the stop. Fortunately, we were not harmed. We both been instructed on how to conduct ourselves. We weren't harmed physically. That was one of those moments where, for me, I began to kind of lose my innocence. So it hurt in that way. I've been pulled over a number of times. Hey, where you going? What are you doing around here? Like, I literally couldn't tell you all of those. I had an experience in Philadelphia that I would describe as life-changing, certainly perspective-changing. I was getting ready to go play overseas. It was Saturday night, and my flight was on Monday. And I went down to Philly to see a friend of mine from college before I left. And he was in Philly visiting his brother at UPenn. So we all went out. There was a group of maybe 10 of us. And, I didn't know my way around UPenn, around that part of Philly. I know how to get in and out. That's it, And my friend, he didn't know his way around either. He was just there visiting his brother. He'd come in on the train. So us two, his brother, and like 8 of his friends go to this bar. And we're just sitting there a couple hours, hanging out, laughing, joking, having a good time. And I was signed to play in Cardiff, Wales. So I don't drink anyway. For darn sure, I'm not going to drink before I get on a plane to go play basketball, right? So we're out all night at a bar, but, listening to music, hanging out. The guys I'm with are drinking, but I'm not drinking. Towards the end of the evening, one of us gets into a verbal kind of altercation with a white guy. And the bartender, the guy who ran the place, saw it. And he stopped it before anything physical happened. He actually stepped between the two of them. And he said, "Hey, this is it. Y'all all need to get out of here." And, he kicked us out. So, two groups are kind of jawing at each other on the way out of a door. It's like a single person door. And as we walked out onto the sidewalk, the police were already present. So in hindsight, I'm guessing the bartender saw what was happening and called them. So as we went out, my group went to the right of the police officers and the white guys went to the left. And the groups were white and black. That was it. He said, clear the area. And so we started walking, and the police start following us. And the white guys start following them. And this place was in the middle of the block. And they're kind of yelling stuff over the police officers at us. And we have our back turned walking away. You know, some of the guys is like this. And me and my friend are like, come on, come on. So we cross the street. We walk from the middle of the block to the corner and across an intersection. And one of the white guys yelled nigger, something nigger, over the police. And I love my friend. He's one of my dear friends, and his brother. And, you know, I didn't know the people we were with, but I liked them. And they all turned towards the cops and was like, hey, you know, why aren't you following them? Why are you following us? And I would describe these young men as righteously defiant. The police basically said, you know, y'all need to keep moving. Just keep moving or we're going to lock you all up. And the white guys are standing right behind them, still yelling, you know, fuck you, niggas, this and that. And so the guys I was with started yelling back, and they start arguing with the cops too. Paddy wagon pulls around the corner of the previous block we've been on right then. Pulls up, they start locking everybody up. And they're like throwing people on the ground, cuffing them. And they have a way of kind of like picking you up by your arms when your arms are behind you. And they were throwing dudes into the paddy wagon. So the last two, and as they're doing this, the group is escalating. They're like, yo, what are you doing? Why aren't you arresting them? So they get 8 of the group in the paddy wagon, and me and my friend are standing there. And I said to the officer, I said, excuse me and my friend here, we're in town visiting them. Can you tell us where you're taking them? And he was like, shut the fuck up and get out of here. And I said, listen, I said, I don't even know where to go. I don't know where I'm at. I don't know where I'm going. Can you tell us where you're taking them so we can find them? And he says, one more word out of you and you're going to jail too. So I turned to my friend and I said, can you believe this shit? My face is up against a wall. I'm thrown on the pavement. My arms are jacked up behind me. And they threw me into the paddy wagon, but they threw me in like in a way that I clipped the door. Like I was parallel to the ground. Now at this time, I'm 6'1", you know, 185, 190 pounds. So I'm not, one person can't pick me up that way. So there was at least 2 of them, maybe 3, I don't know. So they had to like work in concert to do that. So, you know, they take us to jail. They lock us up. And all night they walk by the jail, the cells, and they say, college niggas learned a lesson yet? Now that's the police. That's not the college kids or the white kids. That's the police talking to us. You college niggas learned a lesson yet? And, you know, again, you know, these guys I was with, they're beautiful. They were like defiant. They're like, ain't nothing you can teach us that we don't already know. We know who you are. So we spend the night in jail, and the next morning, they let us out. And, you know, we're all like, why'd you do this? And they said, well, it's, I think I want to say they said it's a misdemeanor to be intoxicated in public. Now, the group had been drinking, right? They were legal age, they were drinking, but nobody was intoxicated. And I don't drink at all. Like I was drinking cranberry juice. I do not drink at all. So it's just bullshit, right? And they let us out. My friend is out there now. And I don't know, to this day, I don't know how he spent that night. Like, I don't know if he was outside the whole night or what. So we all get out and he becomes hysterical. Like he's crying and he's screaming at the police, and we're like pulling him away. And, you know, we're maybe a block. And they apparently had enough of what he was saying, and they grabbed him and threw him on the hood of a car. And we like, hey, look, you already messed with us. We was in jail the whole night. Leave us alone. And for whatever reason, they chose not to escalate it further. So they let him go. So it was, I'm guessing, maybe a 4-mile walk back to the apartment that they lived in off the Penn campus. And those cops from that station would do a slow drive-by of us every 2-3 blocks. There were 3 cars that would do a slow drive by us every 2 or 3 blocks and just kind of look out the window at us like, yeah, we taught you little college niggas a lesson. So I woke up, or I got back to the apartment. It's Sunday. My flight is at like 5 o'clock Monday morning. So I went back to my mother's house, finished the last minute packing I had to do, got on the plane and went to Cardiff. And by the time I came back, any complaint, it was too late. And I didn't think anybody was going to believe us anyway, because it's the cops. Like, who's going to believe, the 10 of us? And that concession, probably a recognition of reality on my part, but it was a mistake. Even if you're not believed, you have to speak up. And I regret not doing that. But they weaponized the fact that no one was going to believe us. They knew that. They knew, these are, 20-something-year-old black men, and they have no social capital that we need to be concerned about. And they felt like they were free to do with us what they would.
It's a horrifying story, and unfortunately not dissimilar from many other stories I've heard. And the part that is perhaps most galling and, again, common is that the white guys who were clearly, at the time the cops arrived, substantially more instigatory than you guys were, and yet their behavior was totally ignored, and the blame for the situation was placed completely on y'all.
Yes.
And I did one of these earlier with a friend of mine from high school, and he lived in a mostly white neighborhood, and the neighbors called the police because he had black friends over, and he also had a white friend over. And the police put all of the black kids in handcuffs and kept telling the white kid whose house it wasn't not to invite the black kids over. It's nothing but trouble. And it wasn't the white kid's house. And the white kid was not in handcuffs. And
Right.
so, unfortunately, these stories are, they're commonplace is what they are. And my follow-up question, amongst your circle, your closest circle of black friends, roughly what percent of them, ballpark, have similar or worse stories with either nonviolent police harassment and unconstitutional harassment, I might add, and non-lethal police brutality, or both?
The harassment, 100%. Both black men and women, 100%. The physical part of it, and I think that at some point we should clearly define brutality. But the physical part of it, I would guess for black men would be north of 80%, maybe 75%, somewhere in there. But if you want to, so if you define the brutality as being hit upside the head, with a billy club, okay, it's lower. If you define brutality as being killed, obviously it's lower still, right? But if you define brutality as they intentionally ram your head into the car when they put you in there, or they throw you into the wall of a paddy wagon, or when they're
too tight on purpose.
Say what?
Put the handcuffs on too tight on purpose.
that. They jerk your arms up, or when they search you, like that's invasive. If you include that, then it's, probably 75, 80%, I guess.
And do you consider 100% of your black friends being unconstitutionally, non-violently harassed, and 75 or 80% of your black friends being brutalized in some form or fashion physically? Do you consider numbers like that to be isolated or more on the pervasive side?
Pervasive. And again, the physical part, I put that number as black men. With black women, I think those numbers are lower. I think that black men, you'll get that just for being. Black women, if you don't present yourself in a defiant manner, it's less likely to happen, I think.
And I'm curious also, because we've talked about in the past that the culture that allows the unconstitutional, non-violent harassment to occur virtually universally, especially to black men and also to black women, and allows the non-lethal police brutality to occur unchecked, that this is a culture that allows the murders of disproportionately black and brown people who are unarmed to occur. And I wish that white people more broadly would understand the cultural connection between the unseen, lesser offenses versus the broadly seen greater offenses. And I'm curious as well, Coach, what else do you have to add? What's on your mind?
Well, I don't think those offenses begin or end with the police. I think they begin and end in words. I think there's a rhetorical violence that black people, where I grew up, lived under constantly. The news, how we were depicted in the media, we were defined as criminals, as animals, through the images they chose to project. And so the physical violence was, a completely foreseeable consequence of that. I think that these practices we're talking about exist. They're pervasive in workplaces, all workplaces, including universities. I have experience in universities where, I've had a supervisor who used institutional power to punish me for standing up to her for saying racist things, threatened my livelihood, and when she couldn't get me fired, she threw in the card of, well, I don't feel safe around Adam. I'm at the time 45, I think. So I've been a professional for 24 years. I've never threatened anybody or harmed anybody, but much like the Amy Cooper video where Amy Cooper was saying, she felt threatened. It was the exact same thing. There'd be one tone of voice with her when she was in an official meeting. And then the minute that she was with me, she was like, I'm going to get you. And, I can say whatever I want. Nobody's going to believe me. And so what I see from the police is the same thing. So it's not a culture of the police and black people. It's America is an anti-black place, is what I think.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because you're right that the police culture of anti-black is but a subset of the overall American anti-black culture. And I think it's important for more people to understand that these protests are definitely not only about police murdering unarmed black people.
Not at all.
But also about how police and the overall criminal justice system treats black people, but also about banking and housing and and education and the whole 9 yards. And so it's been disappointing to me to see that the solutions put forth, one, are absurdly, even for the issue of the anti-blackness we see in policing. But they don't even touch on all of the other anti-black elements of our culture, which is, by the way, pretty much all of the elements. So I'm really, really happy that you brought that up, because it is important to connect all of these different dots and to understand that the topic of racial injustice is a very broad topic that corrupts virtually every aspect of American society, not just policing. So I'm very, very pleased that you brought that up, Coach.
Yeah. Well, in the Dred Scott case in, I don't even know what year that was, Justice Taney in his decision wrote, "The black man has no rights a white man is bound to respect." That was in a Supreme Court decision. That was the Supreme Court wrote that, you know? And this system that we live in, white supremacy, has evolved from then to now. Then it was overt, right? Then it was, we're just going to say it out front. I believe, and I don't think I'm alone in believing this, that America decided to not be overt with it because of the role we tried to play in policing other countries on the international stage. So I believe that, Jim Crow laws, overt segregation, just saying, hey, fuck you niggas, undermines America's global authority when they try to talk to China about how they treat their citizens, Russia, etc. Right? So we can't have that visible. So my impression is that it's become invisible, but it's still present. So off the top of my head, and I'm not using this as indicative of exhaustive research, but off the top of my head, the only case that I can think of where it's kind of like a white-black dispute that a black person triumphed was O.J. Simpson. And the rest of the time, we're on the wrong side of it. So the narrative says otherwise. And we all want to believe the narrative because we all want to live our lives. But the reality is that we have black children being unarmed, being murdered in the street, children. And the people who shot them aren't arrested. And they're only prosecuted when there's demonstrations and riots. So the default is, oh, well, yeah, you do what you want. It's a black kid. Nothing's going to happen, right? We have black people being beaten on video for extended period of time, not by one officer, but while surrounded by 7. And, officers standing there with their hands behind their back watching and then taking turns. And then these officers are exonerated. Rodney King. We've seen 2 videos of officers choking someone to death in the street. And, in one of the cases, they didn't get charged. In the other case, they didn't get arrested until people started, demonstrating. The Ahmaud Arbery case, where this young man was jogging and he was unarmed and he was shot. Now, those are the facts. And the murderers went home because their narrative of the version of events was believed by the police. And they would have gotten away with it, except the video came out. So how many times when these abuses happen, whether they're by police or otherwise, is there a third party present with the presence of mind and courage to film it, right? And the way they do it, the impunity with which they act, in my experience, told me that this was not exceptional for them. This is what they do. And so there's an untold number of these cases that go unrecorded. And a foundational piece of this is when Black people speak, we're not believed. So we've been saying this since I've been alive, and I'm almost 50. And, you know, the streets are on fire right now because of George. 28, George Floyd, 28 years ago, the streets were on fire because of Rodney King. 25 years before that, the streets in Newark were on fire because of John Smith. You know, it's the word you used was pervasive, and it is. And I do believe a foundational piece of that is denying Black people the ability to recount our experiences, to say we're not reliable.
Well, you brought up a lot of interesting and important points. And I want to start with the one that you said last, which is that even with the cell phone video cameras that prove that what Black people have been saying for years is true, you still have a large swath of white people who just don't buy it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing these videos, half with Black people to share their experiences and half with white coaches who I've asked to speak with their Black players about their experiences and report back from sort of a macro data level, what percent of my kids have, to try to drive the point home. And, you know, you also mentioned Dred Scott. And, you know, I think it's really important to point out, as you did, that these things don't stop on a dime. It's like 100 years after the Civil War ended, we had the March on Washington. And then we had 2 packages of federal laws. And if the Civil War didn't fix it, for 100 years, I'm not exactly sure why we think 2 packages of federal laws did the trick, sort of instantaneously. And I'll tell you this, I did a research project on George Patton when I was in college, an independent study. And I was going through the congressional record for getting toward P as in Patton. And I became fascinated by which entries had the most, or which words had the most entries in the congressional record. So as I'm flipping through, I'm at M, and I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't know that was such a topic that was mentioned, you know, for 30 pages worth of congressional records. Well, take a guess which word was mentioned more than any other I found on my way to P between M and yes.
Wow.
And I think it's important for people to understand that if that word was being used freely in the halls of Congress into the 1960s, on the floor of Congress, it's probably pretty fair to say that Congress people who were using that word in 1963 were not allies to Black people in 1966. And it's important to remember the Tuskegee experiment, which deliberately injected Black people with things like lab rats, like subhuman lab rats. That didn't end until the 1970s. And you were not brutalized. You and your group of Ivy League student friends were not brutalized in 1938. You were brutalized in
1996.
Right. And the Mississippi Supreme Court, not exactly a liberal bastion of academia, commissioned a study on the practice of whitewashing juries in 2007, if it's a Black defendant, especially with a white victim. And that they found, the Mississippi Supreme Court found in 2007 that the practice was still rampant. That's their word, rampant. And every other study, whether it's a journalistic investigative study or an academic study, in other states, not just in the South, in Pennsylvania, in New York, every time they do one of these studies, they find that the process of whitewashing juries, especially with a Black defendant and a white victim, remains commonplace. In 2011, Bank of America had to pay a $335 million fine because the Department of Justice investigated and discovered that it was common practice throughout their company that a black person and a white person with the same financial records and the same credit score, the white person was being given the loan and the black person was not. Or the white person was being given the loan at a lower interest rate and the black person was not. And I talk about this a lot. You know, we really can't fight racism until the people in institutional power are not themselves racists, right? And so it's very much of an individual problem as well as an institutional problem. But I'm really glad that you touched on some of those points, because it's so frustrating when you say that, you know, Supreme Court Justice of the United States in the late 1800s, I believe it was, I want to say the same year as the Spanish-American War, 1898. I'm not positive about that. But an American Supreme Court justice at the turn of the century said that black people don't have rights. And if you look at Supreme Court cases since then, like, the standard is not reasonable anymore. It's reasonable in the mind of the cop who committed the race-based malfeasance. So,
well, what goes unsaid within that is it's what's reasonable in the mind of a white cop with a racialized viewpoint.
Correct. And but when they moved that goalpost from objectively reasonable to reasonable in the mind of the cop who committed race-based malfeasance, and that Supreme Court decision was, I want to say, in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And so the Supreme Court has continuously, into the modern era, consistently been an enemy of black people, which speaks to what your point earlier, and that is that it's an American culture of anti-blackness. It's not only is police misconduct toward black people not isolated, but American injustice toward black people is not isolated. So,
agreed. And, you know, the thing is, I believe that one of the solutions to this problem is, and I think we're seeing it play out in this moment right now, is I don't believe there are enough racist white people for this system to stand up on its own as we've experienced it. What I think happens is there's a middle group of white people who believe the narrative. And the narrative, well, if you believe the narrative, you're always going to side with the race of white people, because black people are animals and can't be trusted and what have you. And what the cell phone or the video camera has done is provided some examples where white people look and they say, well, wait a minute, I can see who's lying, you know? And so I don't think the solution to that is that we go around recording each other all the time, right? So should people record a police stop? Absolutely, every time, right? But should we be recording every meeting we have in the workplace? I can see where that's problematic, you know? One of the things that needs to happen is we're saying black people here, but we can make the same argument for women when they're harassed in the workplace. We can make the same argument for, gay, transgender people when they face harassment or discrimination. When marginalized people describe their experiences, if it lines up with the facts, white people believing it and amplifying our voice is the way to dismantle these systems of marginalization. But in order to reach that point, people have to understand the difference between integrity and credibility. Credibility is a power construct. Credibility is something you convey. I deem you credible. Integrity is self-contained. You know, I'm speaking the truth. And when you speak the truth, the facts tend to reflect that. So in the instance of Ahmaud Arbery, he was unarmed. Or in the instance of Trayvon Martin, He was the facts support that that child and that young man were murdered. The facts didn't. The narrative came from George Zimmerman, or I can't remember what the three gentlemen in George's names were, but the narrative came from them, and credibility was given to them by white folks who decided to side with them, even though the facts didn't support it. That's the mechanism that I'm beginning to think I see fraying in this moment right now.
Well,
as evidenced by this interview.
Well, the Arbery and the Trayvon Martin situations are so similar because in both cases, an armed white person stalked an unarmed black person because of their racism. And then when the black person didn't care to be stalked and reacted based out of well-warranted fear, they got murdered by the racist white stalker. And in
which might have been the intent in the first place.
And in both cases, the police just said, "Well, you know, you look like a pretty good guy." And you know, George Zimmerman was a wannabe cop, several-point neighborhood watch guy, and one of the father of the direct murderer was an ex-cop, probably knew people inside the system. But you're 100% right that there's traditionally and to this day, if there are different versions of events, the white version is far more likely to be believed.
Well, you're from Texas.
Correct.
Was the brother's name Botham Jean, who was shot in his apartment?
Correct.
You remember what the headline said?
No, not off the top of my head.
Woman who entered wrong apartment. That's what the headline said. Like the last headline I read about that case was, you know, woman who entered wrong apartment is sentenced or something like that. Entering the wrong apartment was her narrative. He was in his apartment. That's the fact. But her narrative was published in newspapers. Now, if I showed up at your house and did you in and say, "Oh, I thought it was mine," you and I both know that's not getting into the headline.
And you were afraid. Right. That story, like a lot of these, was really under investigated. If you ask me, if she literally did go into the wrong apartment, it's because she's an alcoholic who drinks at work, which, by the way, is a pretty common thing in policing because they know they're not going to get a DWI. They're going to see no consequences for their behavior. If you talk to police officers, much of their day is boring. They're in their cruiser, some of them kind of looking for something to do or looking for a crime, like, oh, he's rolling a stop sign. Let's stop him. Let's see if he's got any drugs. Let's ask questions. Let's pull him out of the car. Let's do these things. And so, yeah, the issue of drinking while on duty is not uncommon in policing because, again, they know there's going to be no accountability for it. The unions aren't going to let that officer get fired. No one's going to give him a DWI. And from the moment that happened, I thought to myself, either she's an alcoholic who was pissed drunk with a firearm at work, or they had some type of relationship and it was no accident. Like the idea that a completely sober person would just go into the wrong place and start shooting in her own apartment complex, that just doesn't pass the smell test. But to your point, the credibility was assumed because she was white, because she was a cop, and especially because the dead person wasn't also white.
Yeah. And that's a part of this. Like this moment we're in, there's two problems with it. Number one, George Floyd is already dead, right? So it's reactionary, and that can't be undone. You can't undo death. So that's problem one. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be protesting. We should. But that points to, well, let's see if we can interrupt these processes at a different point. Problem number two with where we are is they're saying that all politics are local, right? And so then all reform would be local, all protests would be local, right? And like the people in Philly aren't protesting just because of George Floyd. They're protesting because they probably ran into the same cops in Philly that I did, you know? Mm-hmm. But my point is that we have to interrupt these practices in the other areas of our life, the normal everyday areas of our life, because that is sustainable. We can say these things are not acceptable in everyday life so that it doesn't ever get to the point where somebody thinks I can kill this dude because no one's going to believe him, right? And I think that, you know, white people taking the time to speak to and believe Black people and augmenting our voice reveals the people who are racist, because they're not going to want to do that or participate in that. And so then they can't hide. You know, it makes them visible more. And I think it gives us an ability to have a conversation about, well, what do we want our everyday practices to look like? How do we identify these mechanisms at work? How do we interrupt them, you know, in the bank, you know, in you know, housing applications, in, you know, workplace disputes, in, you know, neighborhood disputes? Like, how can we do it at those levels so that we don't have to burn buildings down because somebody was murdered?
I think that's everything you just said is completely spot on. And it really is up to, you talked about the middle, you know, which Dr. King called the moderates.
Yes.
And it really is up to the moderates to pick a side, and hopefully the right one. Because I personally believe that virtually every American white person is a racist. I include myself in that list. I just know there's a scale, right? And so we normally think of like the 8s, 9s, and 10s on the 1 to 10 scale as being the racist, and everybody else is not. And I think that's a little bit harmful as well. I think that if it genuinely is confusing to white people my age and younger especially, to be raised in a nation that simultaneously teaches you to be racist and that racism is wrong. And so that's the reason why so many of the white moderates won't face their own racism, because they've been taught, unlike previous generations, that racism is awful. And I for one, believe firmly that we can't fix the problem unless we admit it. And the problem exists in the brainwashed minds and hardened hearts of white people. We have to look in the mirror and say, I am a racist. I may not be Hitler, I might not be Bull Connor, but I suffer from bias. And if that bias is of a racial nature, then that makes me a racist. And I got to own that, and I got to deal with it. I really think it starts with the self-check first, and then you check others. I'm talking about white on white checking, right? First, you got to say, why did I just think, oh, I don't want to go to my favorite soul food restaurant after dark, right? Why did I think that? Well, you got to check yourself and say, well, statistically, how many white diners are being randomly murdered in Black neighborhoods at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday? You know, you've got to check yourself on that level of personal racism first, I think, and educate yourself better. And then you can be a much better ally and start checking other people. The problem is that like 80% of white people don't acknowledge any level of racism in themselves, and consequently aren't self-checking. And you just can't effectively check others unless you check self. At least that's my view.
Well, if you think of every stage in American history, the narrative has been that we live in a just country. So during slavery, right, the South held, this is the natural state of affairs. This is the natural order of things. Now, if you ask Black people, they say no, right? But Black folks weren't deemed credible. If you go to post-Civil War, definitely after Reconstruction, but probably even during, the narrative was slavery's been done, we've reached a natural state of affairs. This is how things should be. And if you ask Black people during that period, they're like, no. And we were protesting and fighting and, during slavery and during segregation. And if you advance into this period of now, whatever you want to call it, racism without racists or mass incarceration or whatever, again, the narrative is, they call it post-racial society now, right? We reached a post-racial point. But if you ask Black folks, they're like, no, in those ways, nothing has changed, and it's that narrative is part of the problem. And that's something I'd like to see Americans be willing to let go of. I think it would be helpful. And I would also say, and this is just me speaking, for me, it's not my expectation that a white person feel kindly towards me. If they don't like me because of how I look, that really doesn't bother me. That's not my problem. It's my problem if if our systems in society are unfair in a way that they can harm me based on how they feel, and that there's no deterrent from that. That's my problem. And that has been the constant state of affairs, I think.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've discussed many places elsewhere and written other places as well that, you've got individual racism, how the individual feels. Then you've got institutional or structural racism, which is what can the individual do with their own thoughts to cause actual harm.
Right.
And they're connected, of course. But the second issue is much worse. Like when the white person called the police on Dr. Gates, who had lost his key and was opening a window at his own house.
Right.
And, well, I've broken into my own house a lot of times, and my neighbors never called the cops on me. I've walked into construction sites that were open just out of curiosity, and the neighbor watch never rolled up on me with shotguns pointed at my head. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of very normal things that white people do every day. Mike Brown was walking in the street and the cop came up, and the most likely version of events is the cop pulled up and said, in probably an impolite tone, "Get on the sidewalk," right? And Mike Brown didn't really probably feel like getting on the sidewalk that day, didn't appreciate the cop's attitude toward him, and it escalated from there. Well, I walk down the street instead of the sidewalk a lot, especially in Houston where I'm from, because the oak tree roots rip up the sidewalk. And I got bad feet, unstable ankles, so on and so forth. So I prefer walking in the street. And cops have gone past me, hundreds of times while I'm walking on the street, not the sidewalk, and not said anything to me.
Right.
So bottom line is I agree completely. Everything you're saying is spot on. And it sounds like we agree that we really hope that white people will examine their brainwashed minds and their, if not callous hearts, their indifferent hearts soon, because we really can't change the structural institutional racism without changing the people as individuals who perpetuate it. And so, anyway, well, Coach, I really appreciate your time, willingness to share your thoughts with me, and your story was horrible, and unfortunately not just horrible, but common. And that's really the message that I'm hoping to get across to white people, especially white moderates, the non-evil intentioned, but mostly indifferent 4s, 5s, and 6s on the racist scale. which I believe is the vast majority of American white people. And I hope that as the cell phone videos showing them that all along you guys did have credibility, right? That's made a difference. And I hope that this can make a small difference as well, along with many other people speaking up, talking to their friends, engaging on the topic, and so on. So again, I really appreciate your time and your willingness to share.
Well, thank you, Coach, because I think you are making a difference in your book, in this interview, and your willingness to examine, to self-examine. So, respect.
Respect back at you, and we will definitely talk soon. Thanks again.
All right, take care.